Welcome to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM's POTUS.
Welcome to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM for Thursday, December 26th. I'm Andrew Walworth, and I'm joined by RCP President and co-founder Tom Bevan and White House correspondent Phil Wegman. So, Phil, House Speaker Mike Johnson, The Hill, has a report out today with a bunch of unnamed sources indicating that the speaker may be in trouble. The article says, in part, members are calling Trump to dump Johnson. A Trump World source told The Hill before last week's funding fight began. Second source told The Hill that, quote, members are sharing their discontent and concern, citing Johnson's, quote, inability to decide, inability to get it done. And then the source added, quote, the president recognizes that Johnson is somebody he can push around. I think he's weighing the benefits of that with, can this guy get it done? So unnamed sources, but not great reflection on the speaker and his job so far, or his standing with Trump, at least. How much trouble is Speaker Johnson in?
Well, I think we're going to have to obviously wait and see, but just based off of how last week ended, he's in a lot of trouble here. He has grumbling in his own conference, and then folks are taking their grievances to Mar-a-Lago, arguing to the president-elect that Speaker Johnson is not the guy to get the agenda across the finish line. That said, what I'm hearing is grumbling, not outright rebellion, because Republicans, they don't have a big margin to play with, just like they didn't when it came to Kevin McCarthy or electing Speaker Johnson the first time around. There is a possibility that, should there be a speaker battle, that it would be protracted and it would be a bit of a distraction from what Trump wants to be the greatest show on earth, his second coming to a second term. I think I will take some of the challenges to Speaker Johnson a bit more seriously when you have more than just Representative Thomas Massie out there saying that he's going to vote no. And then when you hear some talk about a potential challenger, because again, these guys don't want to run through another week-long effort where they're just sort of, waiting for another speaker to throw his name in the ring. There's not a challenger yet.
Yeah. So Tom, what's the calendar on this? Because that's important, right? We're sort of counting down towards the first day of the Trump administration, and all this has to be resolved before that, right?
Yeah, and they're going to hold the speaker election. The House can't do anything until they elect a speaker. It's their first order of business. And that happens on January 3rd. And then on January 6th is the certification of the electoral results. That apparently can happen without a speaker if it needs to. But to Phil's point, Trump takes office January 20th, and they've got all this stuff lined up. They want to be off and running. They all want to be on the same, sheet of music. And when that happens, and it all started so well for Mike Johnson. I mean, he was down at Mar-a-Lago. He was at the UFC fight,
Right.
He was on the plane when they took that picture of everybody eating McDonald's. So he had done a good job of sort of ingratiating himself into Trump world, and he was solid. And then this spending bill that he put forward that he negotiated, which caught a lot of people, including members of the new administration, Vivek Ramaswamy and JD Vance and Elon Musk and all these folks, totally off guard, and they just absolutely rebelled against it. That was a serious tactical mistake on his part. And while he did get something eventually passed, it wasn't exactly what Trump wanted. Remember, Trump wanted a 2-year suspension of the debt ceiling. That was not included in the final bill. So Trump didn't get everything he wanted. And so that sort of exacerbated, really opened the floodgates for all this criticism to start flowing about Mike Johnson. And so I think one of the arguments that Mike Johnson is making to Trump privately right now is, hey, we don't want, you don't want, I don't want, the Republican Party doesn't need a big, blow up right now at this moment in time. So please support me publicly. Come out and say, because if Trump were to do that, I think a lot of this stuff would go away. He hasn't said anything. In fact, he's kind of said, he hasn't said anything negative, but he took a wait and see approach when he was asked about Mike Johnson. And that, sort of, I don't want to say encourages more discontent, but it's certainly, if he were to come out and say, look, I've got Mike Johnson's back, he's a good guy, he's going to do the job, all this stuff would end immediately, but he hasn't done that yet.
And so, Phil, who's waiting in the wings? I mean, who? Because you have to replace him with
Nobody
somebody.
wants this job.
Yeah, who wants
Yeah,
this job?
who would look at this and say, I can bring peace to the GOP conference? Look, Republican speakers, they have a very short lifespan. Johnson is running into the same frustrations that ended McCarthy, that ended Boehner before him, that perhaps ended Gingrich. What was different about Johnson is that from the beginning, he was sort of not a leadership guy. Instead, this is someone who was, he was a Republican Study Committee chairman. Before that, he came into Congress in 2018. He was sort of a conservative's conservative. He actually jammed then Speaker Ryan and former President Trump during Obamacare repeal, saying that the version of the repeal was not conservative enough. He railed against some of these continuing resolutions, but then once he got put into leadership, and let's also give him some credit when he took control of the conference with just a handful of votes when Republicans only control the House, it was a tough hand for him. He has tried to ingratiate himself with Trump, but I think that has left some of the more conservative members of his conference a little cynical because they say, look, anytime he runs into trouble, rather than taking the fight to Democrats, he runs behind Trump's legs and he tries to, get bailed out. Well, we saw him, like Tom said, at UFC, at Mar-a-Lago on election night. The question now is, will Trump save him? Because, I don't think that there are any members out there currently who, if Trump said, this is my guy, a rebellion against him is a rebellion against me, I don't think they'd be as eager to slow up the train when Republicans control the whole thing next year.
Well, one name that does get mentioned, Tom, is Jim Jordan. He's the chair of the House Judiciary Committee. He's one name that's out there. Yeah. I can give you a couple others.
Steve Scalise. Yeah. Listen, here's the thing, though, and Phil talks about it. It's not about, the people who are bitching to Trump about Mike Johnson. It's not about who's more conservative, right? I mean, Chip Roy's a conservative. He's quite conservative, okay? And and Trump just called for a primary against him.
Yeah, that was amazing.
Because it's are you on board with Trump and his agenda or not? Right? This is not about, I've got a 100% rating from the NRA or the Heritage Foundation, whatever. It's not about like my conservative bona fides, right? It is about whether the speaker is going to do what Trump wants and push through his agenda, even when that might be at odds with some conservative members like Chip Roy on the deficit, for example. And so it's a really unique kind of place to be for a speaker, especially when you've got margins as thin as they are for Republicans in the House. You can only lose like one vote. Right. I mean, I think that's it. And then and Democrats have said, look, Hakeem Jeffries has said, look, we're not saving anybody this time around. So you guys are on your own. So we'll see what happens. It's going to be fascinating. There's still a week left, and maybe he'll be able to convince Trump to shut all this stuff down and support him. But it's just a tough situation for anyone to be in. And that's why it's easy to bitch and moan about, the current leadership. Nobody wants to step up and take this job because it is so difficult.
What about, Tom Emmer gets mentioned, Byron Donald from Florida. I mean, there are names at least. And like I say, if they're going to do something, they've got to replace them with a human being. Or it could be someone from off the hill, I guess.
It doesn't have to be from
It always remind us that it doesn't have to be a member, right? It could be Tom Bevan, right?
It could be Carl Cannon.
It could be Donald Trump Jr. I mean, that's the thing. Like, does the resume and do the details of the resume matter that much? I was talking with a congressional source who pointed out that there's no procedural reform that Johnson or any other speaker could sort of offer the right flank at this point. There's nothing that they could change about the way that the House operates to really, sweeten the deal and get them to stay on board. I think that the die was cast when the red wave fizzled, because the smaller the margins were for Republicans, the more empowered the House Freedom Caucus and some of these rabble-rousers were going to be. There's no such thing as a backbencher in a Republican conference that only has 3 or 4 votes to play with. And as a result, we've seen people come forward and air their grievances. We profiled Speaker Mike Johnson earlier in the year. And there was a lot of grumbling back then when he was trying to get this Ukraine supplemental aid passed. The majority of Republicans supported it, but a lot of conservatives were saying, wait a minute, why are you funding priorities overseas rather than priorities at home? And by the way, the Republican nominee, Donald Trump, opposes it. What Johnson does well is that he goes to members and he speaks with them, and he is not one to play the same type of games on an interpersonal level that a Kevin McCarthy might. That's what I picked up, talking from both his critics and his supporters. Then there are some of his critics, folks like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who are just so far out there in terms of their opposition to him that nothing's going to bring them back to the fold.
Yeah. Well, Tom, I mean, it sounds like he might survive in part because there is no one else who's a sort of a natural pick. As you pointed out, this isn't really about ideology. It's about what Donald Trump wants. And Donald Trump may not want the fight. And here's this guy who, I got to say, when he was named speaker, I had to look him up and find out who he was. I don't follow this as closely as Phil does, but he survived pretty well so far. And he may survive into 2025.
Yeah, he may. I mean, as I said, especially if Trump comes out and supports him, I think that'll put an end to all of this. But we don't know, and we'll find out over the next week whether that happens. I mean, but Republicans, the last thing they need, obviously, is to start the new year with a leadership battle and go through the spectacle that they went through last time when they had to go through 17 votes or whatever it was, and there was shouting at each other on the floor. You remember that confrontation with Matt Gaetz, and I forget the name of Phil will know, the congressman who, they almost went to blows. I mean, they were in each other's face. It was crazy. So they don't want that. And obviously the media makes hay of that, and the Democrats make hay of that. They certainly don't want that just a couple weeks from when Trump takes office, because he's got a lot. Again, he's started off very, very fast in terms of appointments. They've got a bunch of stuff lined up they want to do. They want to be off and running on January 20th, and it's just not going to it's going to be an unwelcome distraction if they haven't settled their differences in the House.
Yeah. Well, Phil, we got about a minute here, but again, he passed the continuing resolution. He kept the government open. He's still got the job today. Give us your prediction. Is he going to stick around?
Yeah, maybe Mike Johnson turns out to be the essential man, and he has to stay in this job, because if you look at the continuing resolution, yes, conservatives hated it. Yes, Donald Trump was unhappy with it, but a majority of Republicans were ready to vote for not only it, but the original version. I think that he has the majority of his conference behind him, and this might just be a job that no one else wants to do.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're going to have to leave it there, guys. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Tom Bevan and Phil Wegman. We're going to take a break and be back right after this.
This is Real Clear Politics on POTUS, Sirius XM Channel 124. Welcome back to Real Clear Politics
on POTUS, Sirius XM Channel 124.
Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Phil Wegman and Tom Bevan. And Tom, Kamala Harris was in the news, sort of. Teamster President Sean O'Brien told Tucker Carlson earlier that Harris told him, or rather told his vice president, Joan Corey, during the campaign, she said, "I'm going to win with you or without you." He also had some harsh words for the Democratic and White House staff. He said what they were doing to Biden, the Democratic Party, kind of looked like elderly abuse to me. So tough words for the Democrats from the head of the Teamsters Union. What do you make of it?
Yeah, I mean, it got a lot of attention over the weekend, despite the holiday, because it's rare that, I want to say rare, but when you hear from a principal, right, who's on the record, who's sort of spilling the inside scoop about what's going down, and you hear it in those terms, it's very revealing and I think shocking to a lot of people. Like the New York Times, for example, has an article out this morning, right? And it says, "Will the U.S. ever be ready for a female president? Democrats wanted to end the electability debate after Vice President Kamala Harris's defeat. A conversation that has frustrated and foiled two generations of female candidates rages on." And then you read that and you think about it, and then you look at this Sean O'Brien story. And it's like, well, was it really that she was a woman? No, it was that she was arrogant. It was the way she was treating members of her coalition, not, talking to them as if they just had to absolutely, it was her way or the highway. And so I think she was just a bad candidate. And we kind of knew that from her previous run, where Democratic voters, got a look at her and decided to go somewhere else. And that was a concern that Democrats had when when there was talk about Biden getting out, whether she was the right one, whether they could put someone, somehow maneuver someone else in place who might have a better chance against Trump, because she just wasn't a very good candidate. And so I think that was just another example, albeit a bit of a shocking one, to hear him say let everybody in on the inside scoop of how he and his membership and his vice president apparently were treated by the Democratic nominee.
Yeah, he ended up not endorsing either party. I think like 60% in the polls for the Teamsters, like 60% of the membership said they wanted Trump. But Phil, what do you make of that? Because that's pretty hardball, saying to somebody, I'm going to win with you or without you, so get in line, to the head of the Teamsters Union, who also gives a lot of money to the Democratic Party, right?
And he said, as soon as she said that, he knew she was going to lose. That Edinburgh, he says, as soon as, he walked out of there knowing that she was going to lose. And this is like 3 weeks or a month before the election.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the thing about swagger is you've got to be able to back it up. And it had, Harris been running a better operation, you could almost sort of like admire that sort of hardball politics where she drives a hard bargain and says, I'm going to win with or without you. But then later we find out from David Plouffe and others who were inside of the Harris campaign that even their own internal polling did not have her significantly ahead. And so I'm curious, what was she seeing? Or was she just winging it, thinking, that she could bully him into an endorsement? Or did she really think that she had this thing sewn up? Because it's clear that this was a mistake. Even had they gone ahead with the non-endorsement, like you mentioned, Andy, there would have been a way to do it without sort of giving her the stink eye, without releasing maybe the public polling of the Teamsters members. But they handled this poorly, and Trump got a news cycle where he was able to, herald the fact that the rank and file supported him.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about, since we're talking about Trump as well, he had this interesting Christmas Eve message for those inmates on death row that Biden granted clemency to earlier. He said this was the message was to the 37 most violent criminals who killed, raped, and plundered like virtually no one before them, but were given a pardon by Sleepy Joe Biden. I refuse to wish a Merry Christmas to those lucky souls, but instead will say, go to hell. Tom, classic Trump, but what do you think?
Classic Trump. We talked about this on our show a couple days ago before Christmas and about, the consistency of position, or lack of consistency, I should say, among some Republicans, but also among Democrats, and Joe Biden in particular being, wanting to avoid putting people to death who have committed heinous crimes, and yet being fully in favor of abortion up until the 9th month or whatever. And I think the part that got, and I said in that debate, in that show, that I was okay with Biden's decision, because I think there is a logical, consistent position. But what was missing from that debate, or what I didn't say, is, and what Trump is pointing out, is some of these people, and this is why Biden has gotten some blowback from this, is some of these people have committed, the worst kinds of crimes imaginable against women and children and the like. And so I think that's what Trump was speaking to. I mean, Trump, he's fully in favor of the death penalty, and that's, his prerogative, and he wants to restart, federal executions, and he did his first term. And I think he sees that as, part of the sort of his law and order sort of aura. And this tweet is a absolute manifestation of that, right? Saying, going out and publicly telling them to go to hell, and that he's not going to wish them a Merry Christmas. So, look, when it comes to the death penalty, it's pretty clear where Trump stands, and that's why, what a lot of people like about him. Not that position necessarily. Well, actually, I think a lot of Republicans do support that position, but the fact that he's just willing to say stuff like that, point blank, that's part of his appeal.
Yeah, Phil, what are the politics of this?
I think Tom hit the nail on the head when he pointed out that you've got Trump, who's part of his brand, is he's the law and order candidate, now the soon to be law and order president. That was something that they argued for during the campaign, and that he tried to demonstrate during his first term. But I think that the juxtaposition between Trump and Biden here is telling. Trump more or less says, "Look, they're guilty. They should go to hell." Biden, on the other hand, tried to take a more compassionate position, but the problem is that he found himself is picking and choosing between monsters. He commuted the sentences of 37 of these murderers and rapists, but then didn't commute the sentence of Dylan Roof or the Boston Marathon terrorist. All of them are monsters. All of them are bad. But it was sort of a muddled application of principle. And I think it's worth going back to the fact that Joe Biden has been saying for decades that he opposes the death penalty, and yet when he was president of the United States, he did not make a serious push to try and get Congress to pass the law. Instead, at the last minute, he sort of short-circuited the justice system and went around them. So, I think the last-minute measure that isn't going to satisfy anyone, and Trump sees an opportunity to win points and advertise that he's going to be law and order.
Yeah. So just so people know, that three people who didn't get clemency: Robert Bowers, Tree of Life synagogue shooting; Dylan Roof, who, as you mentioned, he's the Charleston Church massacre in South Carolina; and the Boston Marathon bombing guy whose name was Sarnoff. I think
all of them evil.
Yeah. And so, it's a question of consistency, which. Totally. Why would you pardon? Why would you exclude these and include 37 others? So a little inconsistency there, but I guess they've got their reasons. Anyway, you're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. We're going to take a quick break and be back right after this.
This is Real Clear Politics on POTUS, Sirius XM Channel 124.
Welcome back to Real Clear Politics with Andrew Walworth. You're listening to Sirius XM's POTUS, Channel 124.
Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Tom Bevan and Phil Wegman. And Tom, we've got this new poll from the Associated Press, which shows that about 7 in 10 Democrats say they are stepping back from political news. About 6 in 10 Republicans and independents say the same. And that's bad news for the cable networks, apparently. We do know this. We know that since the election, CNN has seen a 45% drop in primetime viewership. Overall, this year, CNN has had its worst performance ever among viewers in the key demographic. So what do you make of this? And are people turning off all news, or hopefully they're still tuning into Real Clear Politics?
Right. Well, let's hope that continues. I don't think it is a natural part of the cycle that after an intense election with the buildup, and it lasts forever, that people are just exhausted. They're exhausted by it. And certainly the people who are on the losing side of an election are more inclined to be like, I can't take any more of this. I'm turning off my computer. I'm turning off my TV. I'm turning off my radio. And I'm going to enjoy the holidays, and maybe I'll re-engage in the new year at some point. And that's certainly what has happened this time around, and has happened in the past. I think what's a little bit different is that, after Trump was elected in 2016, and it was such a shock, there was this, there was this immediate resistance, and there was all of this cable news frenzy, and Trump was very good for, cable news as part of they became part of the resistance, right? CNN, I think, famously declared themselves becoming part of the resistance, Jim Acosta and the like, and MSNBC. This time around, it's just total depression. I mean, you've got, MSNBC's down 54. Their primetime ratings are down 54% post-election. CNN's 45%. Fox News is up 13%. So again, Trump's supporters who primarily watch Fox are tuning in to see, eagerly see what he's doing and what's going on, while you've got, folks on the left who are watching MSNBC and CNN who are tuning out. Will they come back? Maybe they will, but even if half of them decide that they're done watching, I mean that's a big problem for these networks. They are going to be in. I mean, we ran a piece on Real Clear Politics this morning from the Washington Post about CNN and how they are struggling to figure out how they're going to make things work. With in the new normal where ratings are significantly lower, and it's just a tougher environment for them as overall.
Yeah, so Phil, I think I have this right. And if you look at the ratings now or the audience for the three main cable news networks, 70% of the total audience for the three is tuned into Fox, and that leaves 30% to be split between MSNBC and CNN. So, those are pretty stunning numbers. And I wonder, is the cable news model just broken?
Certainly, we've seen a stratification of media. No longer do we have the big networks that are calling the shots. Then it became, the big papers and the cable news networks themselves. But, I think that in addition to all of the elements that Tom identified, you have this sort of menu of options where you can go wherever you want for your news. And so if news is a la carte, of course, you're going to have conservatives going to Fox. Of course, you're going to have liberals going to MSNBC. One thing, though, generally that I think is interesting about all of this is not just in the press, but institutions generally. They're seeing public confidence shaken in them. And yet this is happening at a moment when you have Donald Trump, who is enjoying some of the highest approval ratings of his time in public life. And he's going directly to voters, directly to the audience. So institutions seem to be losing credibility. And yet Donald Trump is speaking directly to the people who normally would have used those institutions as intermediaries. I don't know if it comes back. I don't know if it should come back, but I do know that we'll be here. Real Clear Politics, watching all of it. See, I got that plug in there. Be proud of me.
There you go.
Yeah. So, Tom, talking about CNN, Scott Jennings has emerged as sort of the star of CNN. I mean, I see more about Scott Jennings than anybody else in my feeds because he sort of, stands up and sort of throws a pie in the face. It's always him versus an entire panel of sort of, mainstream media types. But interesting dynamic. I mean, that he would be the guy who's sort of is emerging as the face of CNN.
Yeah, I mean, look, Scott's been on that network for years, but this was his moment. And to his credit, I mean, he acquitted himself very well. I mean, he was, and to your point, Andy, I mean, he ended up he was always on panels, but a lot of what he did this year was he would be on a panel on Abby Phillips' show with, 4 or 5 or 6 other people, all of them liberals. And he would just do battle. It was like in the octagon, 1-on-6, taking on all comers. And he would, invariably, again, he's a smart guy, well-spoken guy. He'd make very good points and which, would go viral and not along with his facial expressions and some of the other things. But yeah, Scott had a great year. And he was really the breakout star, not just on CNN, but I think in general. I mean, when you talk about somebody who raised their profile, online and virally, I mean, he was the clear winner of 2024, in my opinion.
But Phil, what do you make of the rise of Scott Jennings?
It's interesting because Jennings was a McConnell guy, right? So right. When he was in politics, worked for former Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who was seen as part of the establishment. And yet Scott Jennings has become almost a MAGA folk hero. He's not necessarily a conservative, but in opposition to what is being put before him on these opinion shows on CNN, I think that you have Republicans of all stripes who are, cheering him on. Because in some cases, he's really pointing out obvious inconsistencies. There are some clips where you're startled by not just the claims that his interlocutors are making, but the fact that they haven't encountered his beliefs, which, aren't always the most fire-breathing MAGA takes. I think Scott said the other day that he was fine with Donald Trump's plan to buy Greenland. But other than that, for the most part, Jennings seems to be presenting CNN with pretty mainstream Republican thought. And if their talent hasn't heard that mainstream Republican thought, I'm curious if they are missing the forest for the trees in their reporting.
Well, Tom, last word. He brought us back to Greenland. Have you? We talked about Greenland the other day. Have
Well,
you
Andy, I knew you were going to bring this up.
Carl and I were pretty much for it.
I put a piece on the front page from Jordan Schachtel on Substack that said, yes, we should absolutely annex Greenland. And I did that just for you because I knew you'd appreciate it. So there you go. Never going to happen, but it's part of the debate.
Good. Well, I appreciate that. Real Clear Politics. We do present all sides, even mine occasionally. So that's good news. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm talking with Tom Bevan and Phil Wegman. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about student loans. So don't go away.
Online at realclearpolitics.com.
On air on Sirius XM Channel 124.
Real Clear Politics is on POTUS. Not bound by any left-right constructs.
Real Clear Politics. Open to a wide political spectrum.
This is POTUS on Sirius XM Channel 124.
Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth, and I'm here with Nathan Harden. He is the author of Man, Sex, God, and Yale, and he's also the editor of Real Clear Education. So, Nathan, welcome back to the program.
Good to be here, Andy.
So I wanted to talk to you about what is going on with the Biden administration in these final days, especially when it comes to student loan forgiveness. So here's my understanding, is that the Biden administration withdrew these two major plans to deliver student loan forgiveness. The way this happened is last Friday, the Department of Education posted notices in the Federal Register that it was withdrawing these plans. So this, I guess, is in anticipation of Trump, who is against student loan forgiveness, at least the way Biden has been doing it. What's going on here, and what does it mean for student borrowers?
Yeah, I mean, Biden has been on a student loan forgiveness kick for a few years now. Famously, the Supreme Court rejected his broader plan last year. But there are a couple of avenues of forgiveness that Biden still has at his disposal. And this sort of anytime news drops from the White House on a Friday,
right,
it's usually because they don't want anyone to pay attention to it, particularly Christmas week. I don't know if that was the case here, but I loved the language of this statement that they released. They had hoped to expand this loan forgiveness even further, but they had to eliminate a couple of the groups that they were planning on including, and those included people who are experiencing financial hardship or who had successfully made payments for a number of decades. And the reason they gave was, quote, due to operational challenges in implementing the proposals. And so I think what that means is we only are going to be here for like 30 more days. And they recognize that, the Trump administration and the Trump campaign, I guess, and Republicans more broadly have rejected these large-scale loan forgiveness schemes as unfair, even illegal. But the Biden administration still was able to do something on Friday, in that they added another $4 billion in loan forgiveness through the Public Service Forgiveness Program, which is something that is intact, and so public service employees and also teachers are still eligible through a couple of different programs. And, it definitely raises the question of fairness. I'm not sure if that's a legal question. I'll let the lawyers, hash that out. But I know the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program is different in category because it would actually take an act of Congress for Trump to overturn that. So that seemed to be a last minute vehicle available to Biden to really push through to the extent he's able these big loan forgiveness programs.
Yeah, that government or public sector, what do they call it? The public service categorization has always struck me as a little un-American or a little unfair. I mean, why would we say that just because you work for the government or for a nonprofit, that you should have student loan forgiveness as opposed to someone who's hosting a podcast or, starting a company or doing any number of other things that you could make an argument, or a pastor. I mean, there's so many other, venues that or things that people do that are worthwhile. Why public service employees? Because that really just means you work for the government or you work for a nonprofit. I mean, there's nothing beyond the way my understanding of that is that beyond that, it's pretty fair game. I mean, if you work for a 501c3, chances are you qualify.
Yeah, it does raise some odd questions about, to borrow a term from the progressives, the equity of the loan forgiveness programs. But I think what they're doing is basically trying to just wipe out as many loans as they legally can or just logistically can in the time that they have left. It does have this strange sort of 11th hour quality to it. It reminds me of the clemencies and the pardons, that presidents traditionally hand down in the waning days of their presidency. And Biden's caught a lot of heat for some of the sentences he commuted last week. But I read elsewhere that actually a lot of the pressure to push these through is coming from Democrats in Congress. So Senator Markey of Massachusetts had a press conference earlier this month, and he basically said, we need to push through as much loan forgiveness as we can before January 20th. Some critics looked at these loan forgiveness efforts as a sort of a political carrot. Is Biden trying to buy the votes of younger voters? This sort of, I think, throws some cold water on that theory, because now there's nothing for Biden to gain politically. Now, do these Democrats in Congress still feel like, the long-term political benefit to them, if Democrats can be seen as promoting these loan forgiveness plans, is worth it? Maybe so. But, Harris was pretty quiet on the student loan issue throughout her campaign. After she took over the top of the ticket, she maybe had a statement or two just sort of touting the forgiveness that Biden had achieved under his administration. But it wasn't a big point, surprisingly, in her 100-day campaign, or however many days it was. But I think it just politically goes back to, this is an interesting question. Whose advantage is it, or is it an advantage politically to do these loans? Let's take the fairness question out of it. There's a sense that Trump has really captured the working class voter, right? And that Democrats, unlike years before, have now been more closely associated with the college educated or the elites. And the big criticism, from the right is that when you do loan forgiveness, it's basically a government handout to the privileged. It tends to be those who are better off, those who are coming from higher socioeconomic backgrounds to begin with, who are going to college. So it's a wealth transfer from the poor, from the less educated to the more educated, from the poorer to the richer. And that's probably the most crippling critique that I've heard of Biden's efforts to forgive these loans. And that, it raises the question for who's going to benefit politically from this, if indeed voters see it as a wealth transfer to the wealthy.
Yeah, it's also
see it that way or not, but that's the argument that.
Yeah, I mean, it's also a question of moral hazard. Is you're incentivizing a certain type of behavior if you forgive loans for this, and why not credit card debt or cars or car loans or anything else?
That's a very good point. Like there's
and then the other thing, of course, is it's inflationary at some level. If if you're trying to tamp down the cost of loans for everybody, or student or college education for everybody, forgiving loans is certainly not the way to do it. I read an interesting piece that said that explained, because I was trying to figure out why. Yeah, they announced this on Friday late in the day. Obviously, that's a Washington gambit, but why they were doing it at all, and not just letting it sort of die a quiet death under Trump. And the reason, I guess, is by withdrawing these rules or draft rules or whatever, it somehow forestalls the Trump administration from picking them up and starting with what's been drafted, redrafting it, and turning it against student borrowers in some way. It also has legal implications because it stops certain court cases and stuff. So it's basically a sort of bureaucratic move, a sort of a chess move here to reset, I guess would be one way to look at the conversation, and force the new Department of Education to start from scratch, as opposed to sort of being halfway down the field and being able to sort of change it. So there's a sort of interesting sort of inside Washington bureaucratic reason why they're doing this, which
sort of like a landmine laying there for the administration, right?
Right. Yeah. So, but part of this certainly has confused people, because, and I'm wondering about that aspect of it. I mean, if you're a borrower, there's a theory, at least, that this sort of, the people will just stop paying their loans because they think they're going to be forgiven, or they hope they're going to be forgiven. And there's all this confusion about this. And I'm just wondering about that aspect of it as well, because certainly student loan debt avoidance is going up. We do know that, right?
Yeah. Well, there was a story in the Wall Street Journal a few days ago about this, and just highlighting the uncertainty that some of these borrowers face. And so I think one of the women they interviewed was a teacher and had, $100,000 or something in student loans, and she was hoping to get them all canceled before Biden's term ended. But now with Trump coming in, she's, there's this uncertainty about what indeed is going to be paid. There's hundreds of thousands of these borrowers who had their payments, their loans weren't forgiven, but they had a freeze put on repayment. And so that raises questions about how many of those borrowers really understand, what's coming down the pike, and are they going to have to resume payments, and how's that going to work, and what's that going to do to the default rates, which are quite high for some of these student loans. So I think we are in for, a lot of confusion, among borrowers in the coming months as policies change. I don't know. I think if you're like me and you look back at, I don't know if you had a lot of student loans. I didn't have a ton compared to some, but I had a significant amount. And there's always that part of you that thinks, wow, I didn't get my student loans forgiven. I paid them back. So, how is this fair? So there's certain borrowers who feel that way. On the other hand, I think very few of us would have refused loan forgiveness had it been offered to us. So I think if this program had come through, 20 years ago or whenever I still had loans, I probably would have taken it whether I thought it was fair or not. So I don't fault the people who take advantage of the opportunity. But from a bigger perspective, I think there's a lot of why questions. Why public service employees? Why now? On the Christmas Eve, in the waning days of your administration, and how much of this is political posturing? Sort of trying to set the narrative or set the stage for 2025 versus a real legitimate effort to to forgive these loans. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, God forbid there's politics involved in any of these decisions, right?
Not the only Nathan, in Washington these days.
Yeah. Well, we're going to have to leave it there. Hey, we've been talking with Nathan Harden. He is the editor of Real Clear Education. You could check it out. It's one of our sister sites, and it keeps you abreast of everything going on in the education world. Nathan, thanks for being with us.
Great to talk to you, Andy.
You've been listening to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you tomorrow. Have a good evening.
The
Politics
of
the
United States.
This is POTUS on SiriusXM Channel 124.